So we have 4 useful criteria for determining whether a book should be included in the Old Testament canon: self-reference, Jewish recognition, Christian recognition, and quotes by Yeshua and the apostles. So let's look at self-reference. And what I mean by that is that one book of the Bible refers to another book of the Bible as scripture, as inspired by God. Or the book itself says, "Thus saith the Lord." Preferably, it's another book that refers back to it, though, because anybody can say, "Thus saith the Lord." So, some examples of this, the Psalms frequently refer back to Torah. They refer to events in Chronicles, Kings, Samuel, into those books. Joshua refers to multiple books of the Old Testament as scripture. Judges refers back to at least events in Joshua and to the Torah. Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, all of these books frequently refer back to Torah again. It creates a mutual confirmation between these books, sort of an interlocking web of authority. This book says that this book is authoritative scripture. This other book says that this one is. This one says that this third book or fourth book is inspired scripture. So using this method, we could recreate, if we just had a pile of scrolls, we could pick out from this pile which ones the other ones recognize as inspired scripture. This prophet says that this book is, this prophet also does. Okay, but then this book says that this other book is inspired scripture, so maybe it is. We can also look at the order that these books were written in, and in part you can tell by the contents of the book. What are they talking about? You can tell by the language of the book. Just like when you read the King James Bible or you read Shakespeare, the language is very different to what we speak today. The same thing happens, although maybe to a lesser extent, but the same thing happens in biblical Hebrew. You can tell when a book in general was written by the vocabulary, the grammar, by the way that the author expresses himself, and historical references or cultural references that he makes. You can tell that a book maybe is written about an older time period, but probably wasn't written in that time period based on comparing the contents of the book to how the book was written. Sometimes you have a book that says, so-and-so is writing about so-and-so. That's not so common with Old Testament books, though. One example is the book of Job. Based on the contents, it appears to be about a character who was more or less contemporary with Abraham. But based on the language, the linguistics of the book, it appears to have been written over a period of time, maybe from oral sources that were then compiled into a book written centuries later that was written in a style meant to emulate an older book. Like if I were to write a period piece today about true events that happened, say, during the American Revolution, I would use different phrases. I wouldn't talk about Facebook or the internet. Depending on which community in the colonies I was writing about, I might throw in some these and thous, just to give the reader a feel of antiquity. And the book of Job appears to be like that. Doesn't mean it's not inspired, doesn't mean that it doesn't belong in the Bible, just it gives us some clues about when it was written and why. Most of the books in the Old Testament are pretty easy to date. We can tell by the things that they reference, events they talk about. Some books, like Isaiah, have some more controversies, because much of the contents of Isaiah doesn't say who wrote it or when, but it may talk about things that supposedly are going to happen in the future. Like it might talk about a man named Cyrus who's going to come and do this or that. It could be that Isaiah wrote that hundreds of years before Cyrus was born. Or it could be that one of Isaiah's students did. Or it could be that somebody wrote it after Cyrus and all those events took place, and wrote it as if it took place earlier. It's very difficult to pinpoint some of those things and to really tell what happened in which way, except that we have references to those things elsewhere. If Yeshua or the apostles said, so-and-so said this about this event that was going to happen in the future, then we can trust that that really did happen. It was written that way. It was written before the events that it talks about. It was a legitimate prophecy. Let's see. The order of creation also tells us something about the legitimacy. If a book is much older but has been preserved throughout the centuries in more or less the same form in which it was written, we can tell that the people of those ancient times really revered that work. They wanted it to be preserved in its original form. So we can put more trust in that. So let's move on to the next criteria, Jewish recognition. Until the time of Ezra, the Jewish canon was probably much shorter than it is now, or that it was even in the first century. Ezra was not just a priest and a theologian and a prophet, but he was a historian. He wrote a pretty good chunk of the Bible, most of Ezra and Nehemiah. He wrote a lot of the histories. He probably compiled those from older sources. Doesn't mean they can't be trusted or that they're not inspired. Ezra was a prophet, and he was working through the inspiration of God. Like I had mentioned before, all of the Old Testament came in multiple scrolls. And so they would talk about, the scroll of so-and-so, the scroll of Joshua, the scroll of Esther, or whichever book you're talking about. But there was no central list of the specific scrolls that Israel considered to be divinely inspired. Ezra sort of formalized a lot of that, at least by tradition. And he essentially put together much of the canon that exists now. Now, there were still some prophecies going on. Several of the minor prophets prophesied at about the same time as Ezra. So, of course, he wouldn't have included those in his canon because he didn't know about them yet. They didn't exist yet. By the first century, by the time of Yeshua and the apostles, the Jews had more or less formalized their canon, and they had divided up all of their literature into 5 general divisions. 3 of those were considered divinely inspired scripture. The Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Torah more or less translates to law. That's not an exact translation, but it'll do for now. Nevi'im refers to the prophets, including the 12 minor prophets. The 12 were generally kept in a single scroll because they're pretty short. The Ketuvim, that means the writings, and that includes the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, things like that. They also frequently included Daniel and some of the other prophets in with the Nevi'im, because there was actually some controversy about the book of Daniel, whether it should be included with the prophets or not. Those 3 categories together, those 3 divisions, the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, those are essentially what we have now in our Old Testaments, or at least what the Protestants have in their Old Testament. And it spells an acronym, Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And that's what Jews frequently call their Bible, the Tanakh, even today. And that acronym dates back to that time period. By the first century, that was probably already what they were calling it. And in fact, I'm getting off track. I'm getting ahead of myself. The other 2 divisions, there was the Apocrypha. That's a Greek word that means hidden writings, essentially. These were books that were respected, read. Some of them were included in the Septuagint. but they weren't necessarily considered divinely inspired, or maybe this small group considered them inspired, but most Jews didn't. We don't have Hebrew originals for any of those books. They were only recorded in Greek. And then the fifth category is pretty much everything else. Doesn't have a name that I know of, but that would include histories and things that didn't have a lot of religious significance, or things that were just plain heretical, or fiction, the things that nobody really considered to have any kind of theological content. It would also include pagan sources, foreign literature. Now, I also talked about the Septuagint. This was written, between 300 and 200 BC. It was a translation from the Hebrew to the Greek of the Old Testament. Some copies included some of the works of the Apocrypha. Most of them included some of the works of the Apocrypha, but there were some differences. Some copies of the Septuagint maybe had, let me see what the copies, maybe Tobit or Judith. Others might have had the Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus or Baruch. But these variations show that these books weren't held to the same level as the rest of the Tanakh. The Septuagint was more or less the King James Version of the first century. It was a little bit dated, but it's the Bible that everybody had access to, at least to some extent. Greek was the lingua franca of the Roman Empire. It's the language that you could go anywhere in the Roman Empire and somebody was going to speak Greek. Many Jews in the first century didn't speak a lot of Hebrew, if any, but almost all of them spoke some Greek. So you could go to a synagogue in Turkey or Greece, Rome or Tripoli, in Gaul, and you would find the Septuagint there. And in fact, that's what a lot of the apostles quoted from. Almost all of the quotes in the New Testament of the Old Testament are from the Septuagint. I think there were, just a note on the Apocrypha, there were between 7 and 14 different books of the Apocrypha that were included in various editions of the Septuagint. Editions, for lack of a better term. I mean, they didn't have a printing press, so editions isn't really quite the right term to use there. As I mentioned, there were no Hebrew originals of the Apocrypha, and this is, some of those Hebrew originals probably never existed. The originals were written in Greek. Others, there just wasn't enough reverence for that work to maintain the Hebrew, and it just wasn't readable by most people. Or the people who were maintaining the authoritative, for lack of a better term, copies of the Tanakh didn't think that it was worth keeping the Apocrypha in the same way. So the people who were copying it, the scribes who were making copies of the Apocrypha for other people to read, copied the Greek. They didn't copy the Hebrew. That's a strong evidence for not accepting the Apocrypha as divinely inspired scripture. Apparently, again, I'm not a scholar, not a historian or a theologian, but there was some disagreement clearly about which books of the Apocrypha should be included with the Septuagint. All of them were written after the book of Malachi. Some of them, like Enoch, claims to have been written by someone long before that. Claims to have been written, in fact, by the prophet Enoch from before Noah. And although it may contain some quotes and some pieces of Enoch's prophecies, it was clearly not written before Noah because it contains references to current events. The language is not the language of ancient peoples. There are just too many evidences in the book itself that contradict that idea. Let's see. There are some quotes from contemporaries that say that the Apocrypha are not scripture. For example, in the first book of Maccabees, which talks about the history of the Maccabean revolt against the Greek rulers, it says itself that the prophets stopped at Malachi, that there have been no prophets since then. So it takes a prophet to write scripture. If somebody claims that something they have written is scripture, but they don't claim to be a prophet, then they're lying. A prophet is someone who gets a word directly from God, that God speaks through to other people. So if you're claiming to write something that is a direct message from God to mankind, then you are claiming to be a prophet. And so if the prophets stop, and this was the general consensus of the ancient rabbis, that the prophets stopped at Malachi. There were no prophets after that. If that's true, then none of the Apocrypha can be inspired, because inspired scripture has to be written by a prophet.